Support for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
Happy New Year. I'm Chris William, and welcome to our program. Thank you for watching and thank you for supporting it. Last week, we talked about 2014 on this annual economic two-part program. What happened? What was surprising about it? How it affected our personal as well as our commercial lives? This week, we look at part two and 2015. Where are we headed? What are the challenges as we try to look around a corner to see what is coming this year? Please stay with us.
Major funding also by Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. On this edition of Carolina Business Review, an economic forecast for 2015, featuring Frank Hefner of the College of Charleston, Doug Woodward, School of Business, University of South Carolina, John Connaughton of UNC Charlotte, and Harry Davis from Appalachian State University. Now, here's Chris William.
Happy holidays. Actually, Happy New Year. Welcome to 2015. Gosh, can you believe it? 15 years. It seemed like we just had the Y2K problem. But gentlemen, it does. Welcome back to our program. John, in one of your recent economic forecasts, you surprised me, as you will do a lot. But one of the things you surprised me about is you said, it doesn't matter if Congress gets along, because whatever Congress does, whatever the government does is not going to affect the economy. How can you say that?
Well, because of oil prices. If oil prices stay in this range of $60, there's almost nothing that the government can do to mess this thing up in the short term. Now, I say short term. I think 2015 is going to be a phenomenal year like we have not seen in quite some time. In that same press conference, I used the term, quoted Bachman-Turner overdrive. You ain't seen nothing yet. And 2015 is going to be that year. Now, short term, this is true. Long term, they can screw things up royally. But in the short term, there's going to be so much momentum because of this. Because of what we talked about in the last show, which is we've put $300 billion in consumer pockets that Harry's documented is spent all over the economy. Every business is feeling this. And every business is looking ahead and saying, hey, look, the prospects out here, as long as these consumers have this extra cash to spend, is I need to get ready to start expanding my business, take advantage of opportunities, which means I'm going to hire some people.
Okay, so first of all, we got some viewers wondering what Bachman-Turner overdrive is, so we can come back to that. But Harry, I want to take it to you because John made the reference about Congress, but let's bring it back to the Carolinas for a second. So in the midterm elections, the GOP firmed its grip in North Carolina and is firmly in charge now for a while, and especially when you consider reapportionment. Right. So in North Carolina, does it matter what the General Assembly does and decides to do about the economy? Can it affect the economy in North Carolina?
Well, it's a little bit different at the state level where the one party controls it all. That's different than Washington where it's split, and Congress isn't going to do anything for a year. I totally agree with John that what goes on in Washington isn't going to affect the economy a whole lot. In North Carolina, it could, because they can do it without anybody stopping them. I happen to think mixed government's a much better form of government where Republicans and Democrats split the power. They did the tax reforms. They may do some more of that in terms of trying to tax services. I hear things about that perhaps coming out of North Carolina, out of Raleigh. But other than that, I don't think they'll do anything that will have a tremendous impact on the economy, again, for 2015, for this year.
Yeah, okay. Doug, in South Carolina, the State House, Governor Haley's on a roll.
Oh, yeah.
South Carolina Commerce is on a roll. So it seems like it's going to be hard to derail some of the momentum. I'm not asking you to agree with that. I'm asking you what you feel about that and how you see things panning out.
Oh, I don't think they're going to derail the momentum that John was talking about. I'm not quite as optimistic as he is. I think we're going to have a sort of another average year of growth in South Carolina. But what they need to do in Columbia, and that's probably true in Raleigh as well, is get an infrastructure bill passed, because our roads are really hurting. We're hearing the business community now speaking out about this, and they're going to have to figure out a way to do that without raising taxes. And I don't have the answer to that, but that's, I think, going to be a big concern. We've already heard this. Last year, 2014, there was a big issue among the business community, and I think it's becoming, if we're going to continue to have this kind of growth, we're going to have to support it with infrastructure.
Yeah, what do you think?
Oh, exactly. And the other thing that's going to happen, and this one maybe Doug can address because he does so much research on foreign direct investment also, is so much of our growth in South Carolina has been foreign firms and actually domestic firms moving into the state.
Right.
Will that continue? And so then the question that I've been thinking about is, if Europe is going to stay in the doldrums, then the marketplace for European firms is going to be in the United States.
Right.
So I think that will increase the momentum for that. So when you're talking about commerce having been on a roll, I think that's going to continue.
Yeah.
So you go ahead, Harry.
Let me just mention one thing about the declining gas prices. You know, the Highway Trust Fund went bankrupt in August, was funded through
It's the Federal Highway Trust Fund.
Yeah, it's funded through April or May in a stopgap measure. The best thing this Congress and the President could agree on would be to raise the gas tax, to actually build the infrastructure of this country. With gas prices down the way they're down, if you added 5 cents to the price, who would even notice in a declining gas price environment? So right now, they could do it and get away with it, agree on a tax increase, and build the infrastructure of this country.
Well,
I don't think Republicans are going to do that.
Y'all are setting this up so well to talk about transportation for just a second. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but you bring up good points. Transportation in the Carolinas, has many people have bemoaned for a long time. Is 2015 going to be the movement that both Carolinas, now North Carolina has a new DOT funding policy, South Carolina, it seems like finally politically they've hit some kind of tipping point. Is this year going to be the year that there actually is a funding and an application of dollars and a plan laid out for both states around funding?
No. And the reason for that is if you look at the DOT plans for the interstates around Charlotte for the next 10 years, all the expansions, 485, 77, et cetera, are all toll roads. So what they're going to do is they're going to put in what we call hot lanes, high occupancy / toll lanes. And as a result of that, you're going to get your extra lanes, but if you want to use them, you're going to have to pay for them. And that seems to be the new approach rather than what Harry suggested, which is put a nickel, 10 cents onto the gas tax, and deal with this in kind of a fair, equitable way across the board. It's not that big a deal, Chris, for you to have to pay an extra couple of dollars to drive to work every day, but it is for a lot of people to do that. And so they're trading off time versus their income. And we have made a decision in this state anyway that our future in transportation expansion is going to be pay-as-you-go on a toll road basis, more like New Jersey and New York, as opposed to what Harry is suggesting.
Fund it.
And that is fund it and make it sort of fair across the board.
So the governor in South Carolina has been the barrier for any type of gas tax being talked about or actually being applied.
Yeah.
Will she relent? Will she have to relent?
I think if the business community puts pressure, and in particular the trucking industry, if they want it, if they're the ones going to be paid for it because they recognize that they need this, I think the logic will be she'll go along with that, and that pressure is coming. Sure.
And given that distribution centers is one of the focal points for economic development in South Carolina, you can't have distribution centers with bad infrastructure. And so when Commerce says we can't recruit because we do not have, then I think you're going to see a
already
major
saying
change.
that.
And they're already saying that, but it just hasn't happened yet. And that's a question of political will and things like that. So will that happen in 2015? I'm not going to flip a coin on that one, whether the
It'll
General
take time,
Assembly will get
But Harry's
that
right.
going.
I mean, this is if you're ever going to do it,
Now would be the time.
this is the time to do it with as minimal political backlash as possible.
So you get coverage because the economy has bailed us
Well,
out.
you know, what's
Unless you signed a
interesting-
pledge, no taxes get raised.
What's interesting is we've seen the gas prices drop dramatically through the end of 2014. okay? But interestingly enough, they're actually going to drop some more in the early part of 2015 because there's about a 6 to 8 week delay between when oil prices fall and the gas prices fall.
Okay, one more quick one-off question about transportation. As you have so eloquently noted last week, John, the price of gas has dropped some 40% over the recent history. So will we see a drop in airfares? Because we haven't yet.
You're asking me? Because
I'm asking anyone.
It's an easy answer, no.
No.
And the reason is that we've had such consolidation in the airline industry over the past half a dozen years with the mergers that have taken place, the most recent one being U.S. here with American, that we don't have a lot of competition in that industry. And so this is simply a situation where it's a lot easier for them not to respond to reduced costs. They just don't have the direct price competition with each other that they at one time had. As a matter of fact, what we're seeing is a prospect of airline fares actually going up, the base fares going up in the next couple of weeks.
On what term? For what reason?
Competition. You cannot go from 6, 7 national airlines is what we had several years ago, down to essentially 3 major carriers right now, and not suffer something in the way of
Is there an
It's gonna
antitrust issue in
It's
here?
going to take time because they do long-term contracts on their purchasing. So
Yeah.
they're paying old prices. And so it'll be a while
Okay.
before they renegotiate. But in the meantime, they also have a lot of profits that they need to make up for.
Yeah, a lot of
so-
were in bankruptcy.
Yeah, so they
5 years
got that
ago.
issue. The other thing that they need to make up for is they got a lot of antiquated aircraft in the skies. So there's going to have to be an increase in purchasing.
Yeah,
on that.
okay.
what we're
Let's move on. Let's talk about jobs because we're going to
Which
run
is
out
good
of
for
time.
Boeing.
That's right. So let's go to South Carolina. Doug, you have articulated that South Carolina's rate of unemployment is higher than North Carolina. That's that flip-flop.
Right.
That's a recent
Higher
phenomenon.
than the national average.
And
too.
higher than the national
Right.
average.
Almost
So
a percentage.
let's just for a couple minutes talk about where unemployment will go in 2015. And in South Carolina and North Carolina, immigration is not a small issue. How does immigration affect unemployment and those who are employed and jobs available? Doug?
Okay, well, we are forecasting for 2015 the unemployment rate to drop to about 6.2%. Okay, at this stage of the business cycle and an expansion like we're in, the 6.2%, I mean, that's almost recessionary. So it's still, at least in South Carolina, a slack labor market. One thing that's happening, though, is more people are entering back into the labor market. The labor force participation rate is going up, which is good. People are more actively looking for jobs, but it's still we're looking at a very high, relatively high unemployment rate, and so the other question was
how does immigration kind
Immigration.
of yeah.
We had a big surge of immigration, 10, 15 years ago when construction was booming, and that's been down. And now it's just much more difficult for at least Hispanic immigrants to find jobs in South Carolina because we have such restrictions on hiring practices that we didn't have.
So Harry, how does that factor in North Carolina?
Well, in North Carolina, in 2014, we grew at least 90,000 jobs, let's say. This year, 2015, we'll grow at least 115 to 120,000. Those are good. Both years are very good years for employment gains. So North Carolina will experience another good year this year. Immigration, I don't think will have any impact on it in any serious way. The policy in Washington that came out of Washington won't impact those numbers at all, I don't believe.
Will that policy change? Any forecast on whether the policy is going to change dramatically? I know the president put a stake in the ground right before the holidays around immigration, but do you see that Congress is going to adopt something?
What we need is serious immigration reform in this country. I mean, that's something, if the president and Congress could actually do that, that's something that could have a significant difference on the economy as we go down the road.
Yeah.
It's something we have not done. We need to drive up the labor participation rate in this country. It's at a 35-year low, and the way to do it is to allow more people into the country that have skills that are needed in the Silicon Valley, and also to allow more of the people that are here illegally to become legal, get a process in place. They then buy houses. They're not going to buy a house if they're illegal. So immigration reform is so incredibly important for economic growth in this country. That's something that Congress needs to do, along with building the infrastructure.
So how do we drive up the participation rate in the labor market?
Oh, good question. But I want to get back to two things he said on that one. And one is one of the biggest problems we have is the visa requirement for skilled workers. That is hurting some industries in the United States. And so we have the floodgates open for unskilled coming across the border, which is creating lower wage pressure in lower wage type jobs, and we're having shortages in skilled workers because we don't have the visa capability of getting those people in. Silicon Valley's been begging for that for a long time. So what we need to see is all of those kind of reforms taking place. But in terms of where we're going to be in employment, you're going to see the growth in the higher skill sets. Manufacturing is a higher skill set, and so you're going to see the growth there. It's also a higher wage, but you don't get 6,000 employee plants popping in your neighborhood every day. Most manufacturing plants tend to be fairly small these days.
To answer your question about labor force participation rates, there's not a lot you can do, because what's driving, again, in contrast to the popular notion that somehow or other discouraged workers are driving this lower labor force participation rate, which is not the case. What's driving this lower labor force participation rate are baby boomers retiring.
Yeah, the academic research shows that now.
It's so incredibly clear that the narrative has been misguided, and that what we're really looking at are older folks, people in their 60s, the leading edge of the baby boomers that are now retiring. And they unfortunately they don't leave the equation just because they get older. All right, they're still still in the denominator.
Thing is, at least they can retire now because markets are
Right.
improved and will continue to improve.
And so there's not a lot we can do about changing the 77 million baby boomers coming up and their voluntary retirement, which is going to dramatically change the labor force participation rate, because the age cohorts of the people that will be entering the labor force, the 5-year age cohort groups, are much smaller by about 2 million each in each age group than what's leaving, and so that's where you have the problem. So it's back to what Harry said. There's only one solution to this problem.
It's immigration.
And that's immigration reform.
So last question on this immigration thing, and we're going to move on. If reasonable people agree that there is a schizophrenic type of nature to the lack of immigration policy, if we all kind of agree on it, why can't we move the ball? Is it purely politics?
It's just like gas taxes. It's the third rail of politics.
Yeah, and it's such an emotional thing for people. People have opinions about it and very few facts, and that's the biggest problem with immigration.
That's a great way to end it. Thank you, Harry. Let's move on, because all of these things are important. So the Affordable Care Act, been around for a while, seen the effect, but in 2015 we will see more of a full effect as more of it's adopted, as more of it's opened up. How do you think the ACA is going to affect the economy, employers, and how people feel? Anyone?
Well, in South Carolina, we've already seen, but this was happening before ACA was passed, but maybe in anticipation of it, a shift to more contingent, part-time, and contract labor. And I'm not convinced ACA had everything to do with that, but I think that's one of the the long-term shifts in the employment market we're already seeing anyways, and it probably just encourages that.
Plant size also, because of the threshold of when you need to offer for health care and benefits. So you're going to see smaller firms as a result of that also. But as far as the rest of it goes, I think...
on the Affordable Care Act?
Yeah, I don't think You're
not going back to immigration.
No, I'm not. No. My grandparents immigrated. So, but anyway.
And we're all thankful.
Yes, I am too. So the thing is
I
that...
want you to migrate, but go ahead.
He wants me to leave, I know.
We're never
he wants me
gonna
to
get
shut
through
up.
this question.
But the thing is, nobody really knew what the Health Care Act looked like. We know that already. No one in Congress read the 900 pages. And at the rate the way it was written, even if they couldn't have figured out what the detailed regulation would be. It'd almost be like financial regulation.
Right.
It was passed, but nobody knows what it means and what's going to happen. Well, we now have had a year, some experience on it, and it turns out that we still don't fully understand it. However, it hasn't been a catastrophe. So that's where I think we're seeing some more certainty now and some more positive approaches around
But there are two
this.
things coming up. One is the employer mandate hasn't kicked in yet.
Right.
And that's been postponed and postponed and postponed. So that's one thing. And that's going to kick in again in about a year from now. And, leading up to that, there's going to be some interest in that.
Do you
But
think
the
there's
second
more about
thing-
the fear of unknown about the employer
Oh, yeah.
mandate than there is about the actual mandate?
I agree. Again,
Okay.
this is a facts issue versus opinions issue. But the second thing, and I think is more important than anything else we've talked about here in terms of the Affordable Health Care Act, and that is the Supreme Court decision that's going to come up this year concerning whether or not the subsidies can go to the non-state-run exchanges, such as North and South Carolina. If those subsidies don't if those subsidies are declared unconstitutional or not consistent with the law, then this is what's going to wind up scuttling the Affordable Health Care Act. I don't think anything else is. I mean, we can get rid of the device tax. That's a no-brainer. It's not a big. It's a dollars number. It's not a big deal. If the subsidies don't go away, there'll be some type of fixing with the Republican Congress and the president to keep the thing going forward. I don't think there's that big a will on the side of the moderate Republicans to pull the plug on this thing. They'll have a symbolic vote again, but I think that the big issue is what the Supreme Court does. It's just basically unknown.
Go ahead.
And
Go
just,
ahead.
just to follow up on what John is saying is that you're going to get big disparities in states in terms of who's got coverage. Some states are already moving very rapidly towards full coverage for all their citizens. I don't see that happening in the Carolinas, and that.
Well, but Governor McCrory in North Carolina has talked about being open to accepting Medicaid dollars,
Is that
Harry.
right?
He has said
Okay.
that, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So it sounds like he's tilling the ground. In South Carolina, there's been no talk about that.
No,
Would you
he's-
expect that Nikki Haley would be open to it at some point?
Not Medicaid.
Yeah.
No, not at
He's
this
definitely
point.
going to try to do that, I think. I think he's very sincere about that. I think dealing with his own party in the House and the Senate is a different issue, and I'm not sure they will go along with that.
Yeah, just as a kind of a sidebar question, Harry, do you think the contentiousness, or what is appeared to be contentiousness between, within the Republican Party in North Carolina, and that is the governor's office and the Senate and the House, seemed like they ought to be working a little bit more in concert and haven't been working.
Right.
Do you think some of that will work itself out, or will
I
it?
think that it will. I think, part of the problem is when you've been out of power for so long and all of a sudden you have this power, you really think you're powerful. And so you've got three different very powerful people trying to sit down and work together, and each of them thinks they're really powerful and they're not used to it. The governor is, but us running, the Republican Party running the House and the Senate, that's something they're not used to. That's a problem for them.
Brookings Institution, on a related but completely different story, sounds like a Saturday Night Live setup, on a related but completely different story, the Brookings Institution at the end of last summer released a report that was eye-popping, and I'm not overstating this, that said the cities with the largest growth in poverty populations, okay, so get this in your head, the largest expansion in the growth of poverty populations, that the top 10 cities in the country from the year 2000 to the 2008 through 2012 census, 50% of those top 10 cities were in the Carolinas, and they weren't small cities. They were Greenville, South Carolina, so they were the upstate that's clearly an economic growth. They were Charlotte, they were Raleigh, they were Winston-Salem, and they were Greensboro. This is a surprising turn and a dubious turn at best. Does this surprise any of you to have that kind of explosion in the growth of poverty populations in what have been progressive states when it comes to economic development?
It's also true at the national level. The highest poverty rate right now in the United States is for young adults. The lowest poverty rate right now is for elderly, is for people 65 and over. It's the silent majority, the silent generation, and the post-war boomers. They have the lowest poverty rate. It's young adults that have the highest poverty rate. That's true not only in North Carolina, that's true nationally.
Isn't that normal, though? That sounds like you come out of school, you don't have two nickels to rub together.
But it's actually a reverse. Before 1959, the group with the highest poverty rate in the United
Seniors.
States were the elderly.
That's why the Great Society under Johnson was passed with Medicare and those types of programs, because of exactly that. That was the bulk of poverty were old people, and we forget that. The poverty rate is really interesting. The poverty rate in the country hadn't changed when you look at the kind of the moving average of it. It's 15% back in the early 60s. It's 15% today, but the makeup of who's in poverty has changed dramatically. And we don't talk about
Is
that.
it alarming? Is it an alarming thing, or is it expected if you look at the statistical evidence?
Well, look at the labor participation rate is actually falling for young adults because they stay in school forever. They're in school for 6 years. They're on the 6-year plan. Then they graduate, go home and live in the basement. They didn't get the right degree, go back to school for 2 more years to get a master's. They're out of the labor force for 8 or 9 years. They're in poverty.
But that's true across the country. Your question is,
The
from
question is,
Brookings Institution report is what's happening in the Carolinas.
Why those locations?
And I have to tell you, we ought to be looking at the quality of jobs that are being created.
Okay,
We're looking
that's the last
The
word.
quality of jobs that have been lost.
Okay,
essentially.
quality of jobs
That's
lost.
true, too.
That's the last word, because we ran out of time, but I'd like to invite you guys back, not next year, a year from now, so we can do this again, while that would be important, but maybe to talk a little bit deeper about poverty in the Carolinas and why it's exploding, given that making more money in many cases than we ever had before. Gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you.
Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Best of luck.
gonna be a
Safe
great New
travels. Thank you for being on the program. Good to see you. Thank you for watching our program. Until next week, Happy New Year. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.org.